Okay, we are back for a good old-fashioned comparison video, and this one was highly requested in the comments of some of my recent videos, particularly the video I made about the COROS Pace Pro. This is a brand new watch from COROS, but in the comments of that video, a lot of people were comparing this watch at its price point to some of the competition, namely being the Suunto Race S, which is the exact same price, the Garmin Forerunner 265, and the new Polar Vantage M3 that came out just a few weeks ago. So in this video today, I just want to run through all of the features and specs and share my opinion on which one of these watches might be right for you, because as I mentioned before, they're pretty much all in the same ballpark in terms of pricing, but there are some pros and cons when it comes to each one individually, and that's what I plan on covering today. Before we get all the way into it though, a couple of things I want to mention. First of all, at this price point, I'm excluding previous generation models like things like the Garmin Forerunner 255 or the 955, simply due to the MIP displays. All of these watches here on the table have big bright AMOLED displays, and I think if you're in the market for these, that's what you're going to be looking for, so I'm going to exclude all of those other models. Another thing to keep in mind as we go through this is that I'm not going to dive through every little menu item on each one of these watches because there's 4 of them here, and if I were to make an in-depth review of all these watches in one video, this video would be like an hour long. So we're going to keep this pretty high level and try to get through these things as quickly as possible. Yes, I am snapping. If you want to learn more about each one of these watches individually, check out my in-depth review that I have for all 4 of these watches, and I'll have that linked up here or down below. Oh yeah, and one more thing before we move on, a spoiler if you will, all of these watches are really good. Like, none of these watches are bad. In fact, they're all really awesome, and I've really enjoyed my time with all of them. To kick things off, let's talk about the pricing and options with all of these different watches. All the way on the left side of the screen here, we've got the Suunto Race S. This comes in at $349 here in the USA. However, there's actually 2 different versions. There's also a titanium model that's $100 more, that's $449. So if you want the more premium material, you do have to pay for it. Next up, we do have the Garmin Forerunner 265, and this watch comes in at $449. So it's a bit more expensive than all of these other options. Next up, we've got the Polar Vantage M3. This watch is currently $399. And finally, the COROS Pace Pro coming in at $349. Another thing I want to mention is sale pricing, because that's where things get kind of interesting. With the COROS Pace Pro, this watch is probably never going to get discounted or put on sale because COROS almost never puts their watches on sale. The price at launch is pretty much the price forever until they are discontinued. Now, when it comes to these other products here, typically you'll find that the Polar and the Garmin will be on sale. I can expect like a Black Friday sale coming up on the Garmin Forerunner 265 specifically, but time will tell. So it's really going to depend on the timing you're watching this video as to what the pricing is. Hey there, quick interruption. If you're finding this video fun or useful in any way, I would really appreciate it if you go down and give me a thumbs up and subscribe to the channel down below so you don't miss more videos from me in the future. And while you're down there, also check out the video description down below where you'll find links to all of these watches. Those links do help support this channel, but they cost nothing extra to you, okay? Back to the video. Next up, let's talk about the hardware and build quality with all of these different watches, because that's a big variable here. When it comes to the Garmin Forerunner 265, this watch is pretty much entirely made out of plastic. You've got a plastic or polycarbonate case. You've got pretty much plastic on the back here. The only part that is metal is actually the buttons, and then the clasp on the band is metal as well. But generally, I still like the build quality on this watch. It still feels pretty durable. Next up, let's talk about the COROS Pace Pro, because in a lot of ways, this watch has very similar build quality to the Garmin Forerunner 265 here. The COROS Pace Pro is also pretty much entirely made out of plastic. You've got a polycarbonate shell on the back, you've got a plastic bezel on the front, and the only part that is metal is the digital crown here, which you can both roll with your finger and click as a button. This back button on the bottom here is plastic as well. On the Polar Vantage M3, you've got this stainless steel bezel. And like I said, there's a couple of different colors when it comes to this watch. So you either get the beige and gold color here or a black version as well. So this is metal around the perimeter of the watch face here. The buttons on the side here are also metal, and there's a pretty interesting red accent in the middle there. And then you do have a metal clasp on the band as well. And generally, this feels like a really nicely built watch. It feels like it's gonna hold up over time. And then if we jump over to the Suunto Race S here, out of all of these watches, I would say this is probably the one that feels the most well built. This watch has a stainless steel construction, it's got metal buttons, the side of the case here appears to be metal as well. You've got a metal bezel, and overall, it just feels really nice in the hand. It feels like a premium watch, even though the price point at $350 for the version I have here is, pretty low compared to how it feels in the hand. When it comes to the included bands or straps in the box with all of these watches, they all do come with a silicone band or rubber band in the box. And as you can see, they are all quick release enabled, which is an industry standard, which means you can buy all kinds of different colors and materials off places like Amazon and swap them out as you please with no tools required. Okay, next topic is going to be displays. All of these watches have big, bright AMOLED displays, but there are some differences between all of them as I try to keep them all awake on my table here. So all the way on the left here, we've got the Garmin Forerunner 265 with a 1.3-inch AMOLED display. Keep in mind there's two versions of this watch, like I said, and the smaller version does have a 1.1-inch AMOLED display. The COROS Pace Pro here, again, has a 1.3-inch AMOLED display. The Suunto Race S here has a 1.32-inch AMOLED display, so just a smidge larger than the Garmin and the COROS. And finally, we've got the Polar Vantage M3, which has a 1.28-inch AMOLED display, which I think we could just round up and call 1.3-inch, because in practice, they all pretty much feel and look the same way. They're all really nice displays. And in terms of visibility, I have no issues with all of these watches. I can see them in direct sunlight without an issue, and they're all very bright and vibrant, and they're a pleasure to use. I really like the displays on all these watches. However, there are some differences between the displays on these watches. Because the Garmin Forerunner 265 and the Suunto Race S are slightly older, they have a slightly dimmer display. These watches have a 1000 nit display, and that's in terms of brightness. The Polar Vantage M3 and the new COROS Pace Pro both have a 1500 nit display. So when you're out in direct sunlight, if you're at the track and it's really blaring down on your watch, the Polar and the COROS will be ever so slightly easier to read because of that increased brightness. Now, when it comes to the actual protection of the display, the glass over the top here, all of these watches use some form of mineral glass. Now, because of that, none of these watches are going to be scratch proof. If you whack them against a wall or a concrete brick or whatever, you're probably going to scratch the lens. And in my experience, the Garmin Forerunner 265 here out of the bunch is probably the most susceptible to scratches because it does have a domed glass display. As you can see there, it is protruding out of the watch, and because of that, if this falls down on something like a surface, it's going to be the first point of contact will be the glass. Next up, let's talk about user interface and functionality and responsiveness. So as you can see here on the Garmin Forerunner 265, it's got a very familiar Garmin user interface that's sort of vertically scrolling. And as you can see, when I touch this display, it is very fluid and nice and responsive, and there's not a whole lot of lag. And keep in mind, because this watch has 5 buttons, you can fully interact with this watch by the buttons and not have to use the touch display at all if you've got sweaty hands or gloves on or something like that. The COROS Pace Pro also has a touch-enabled display, as you can see there. And in my initial review of this watch, I said that the scrolling was a little bit weird and hard to use. However, in a recent firmware update, they fixed it. And the scrolling now is super fluid, as you can see here, and it's a really nice experience to go through all of the widgets on this watch. It's even got sort of like inertia scrolling now, where if you kind of swipe, it goes through multiple widgets at a time. And that wasn't present on the first version of this firmware, so that's good to see. Jumping over to the Polar Vantage M3, this has a different user interface where you swipe horizontally, but again, it's very fluid and easy to use, and there's really no lag or waiting for anything to load. I will say that the user interface does feel a little bit dated at this point because they've been using the same interface for a number of years. However, right around the corner, there is going to be a firmware 3.0 release on the Polar Vantage M3 that will update a lot of these screens to make them feel and look a little bit more modern. Finally, we've got the Suunto Race S here. This watch also has a vertically scrolling user interface. Again, it's got a digital crown on the right here, but you can also scroll with your finger. And it's very responsive, though I think out of the bunch here, out of all of these watches, this one might have a slightly less responsive experience. It's got a little bit of lag when you scroll through things, though it's still very usable. And honestly, I would have no complaints if this was the only watch I used. Next up, let's talk about sensors on all of these watches. So all of these watches do have built-in sensors for a compass, an accelerometer, a gyroscope, altimeters, and of course the optical heart rate sensor on the back. And all of these watches do offer SpO2 sensing or blood oxygen sensing as well. And we'll talk about accuracy of these sensors later in this video. And on top of that, all of these watches do support external sensors as well. That's things like chest heart rate sensors like I have here that are ECG based, and you can pair that with any of these watches. You can also pair things like power meters on your bike, radars on your bike, things like that. And the support there is pretty much the same across the board. However, the Garmin Forerunner 265 here does have a few advantages because of the Garmin ecosystem. So all these other watches here, from the COROS to the Polar to the Suunto, support Bluetooth external sensors. The Garmin Forerunner 265 here is the only watch in this lineup that supports Bluetooth and ANT+. Now, ANT+ is an older protocol, and there's really not a whole lot of new sensors coming out today that are ANT+ enabled. However, if you do have a huge collection of sensors like power meters, which can be very expensive, that are ANT+, that might be the reason to go for the Garmin right there. The Garmin Forerunner 265 also has another trick up its sleeve where it does support the Garmin specific accessories. Those are things like the Garmin InReach Mini, which you can send satellite messaging to and from, dog collars, which will also integrate with your watch, and all of the other Garmin stuff out there. There's like archery accessories and all kinds of things that will connect to your Garmin watch as well. And that's where the discussion of the Garmin ecosystem comes in. And this is going to be another big deciding factor. So if you're somebody who is a multi-sport athlete, if you're a runner, but you're also a cyclist, or maybe you do triathlons or something like that, this watch pairs with Garmin Connect. And other devices made by Garmin also pair with Garmin Connect, like their Edge cycling computers. So if you're a cyclist and you go for a long ride with your cycling computer and leave your watch at home, you can record that ride, it will sync to Garmin Connect, and all of that information and data will also be uploaded to your watch as well. Things like your training load and your estimated VO2 max, all of that data will be synced seamlessly to your other Garmin devices as well. The only other watch in this lineup that's able to do that is the COROS Pace Pro, because COROS not only makes their watches like the Pace Pro here, but they also make the COROS Dura bike computer. Generally speaking, I do think the Garmin integration between their bike computers and their watches is a little bit more seamless and efficient because they've been doing it for a very long time. Where COROS just launched the COROS Dura a few months ago, it's still very new and they're still working out the kinks, but it works just fine as of now. So if you are a cyclist and a runner, take a look at the Garmin and the COROS. Unfortunately, the Polar and the Suunto don't support that sort of thing. Moving right along, let's talk about health and wellness features. All these watches collect your all-day health and wellness features, and they all do the same basic stuff, like your step count, your calories burned, your sleep metrics. However, there are some differences between the three, and in this segment, I would say that the Garmin Forerunner 265 probably has the biggest advantage. So on the Garmin Forerunner 265, you not only get all the basics like your step count and things like that, but you also get things like your training readiness here. And if I dive into that, training readiness is basically an amalgamation of a bunch of different metrics like your sleep data, your sleep history, your recovery time, your HRV status, your acute training load, and your stress history. And it rolls all that data up and gives you a single score to let you know how ready you are to take on more training. Now, if I scroll down, we've also got my estimated VO2 max here, and then we've got HRV status. And again, this is a very useful metric as well. HRV status will establish a baseline of your HRV while you're sleeping, and then this little graph here will let you know if you're deviating from your baseline, if you're too high or you're too low. And if you're too low, it might indicate that you're overtrained, you're getting sick, or maybe you had too much alcohol the night before. And of course, on the Garmin Forerunner 265, you also get Garmin's body battery. Of course, all these metrics are blank because I've been using my Fenix 8 for the past few weeks, but you get the idea. The Garmin body battery, again, is a very useful feature that's based off, I think, HRV and some other metrics. And what it does is it sort of turns your body into an imaginary battery, where if your battery is at 100%, you're going to be well rested and ready to take on the day. And if your battery's at 5%, you're going to feel pretty wiped out and want to take a nap. And I find this useful just to validate the way I feel. Jumping over to the COROS Pace Pro, we can scroll down here. And again, we've got all of the basics, the step count, the stairs climbed, active time, calories burned, etc. And then we've got other metrics that are not on the Garmin here, but are pretty unique as well. So you've got got something called your running fitness index here. This is based on a 0 to 100 scale, and this will give you a ballpark on your fitness. It's kind of like estimated VO2 max, but not actually VO2 max. Scrolling down again, we've got my 7-day training load here on the COROS Pace Pro, which is good to see. Then we've got my performance condition here. This will show my intensity trend, my base fitness level, which is sort of like estimated VO2 max, and my load impact as well. Now, if I scroll down, I've got a recovery advisor here. Then we've got things like my all-day heart rate, and then we've got my stress for the day, which again is very useful. The stress metric here is very similar to Garmin's stress metric, and you can kind of use this as a form of Garmin's body battery in a way where if your stress is very high all day long, it probably means that your body's trying to recover, or you could be coming down with an illness as well. And just like on the Garmin Forerunner 265, the COROS Pace Pro also supports HRV, and it has a very similar interface that looks a lot like the Garmin's HRV status, but they're not calling it HRV status for probably legal reasons. Moving over to the Polar Vantage M3. So as you can see here, if I swipe to the right for my watch face, again, we've got all of the basics, my step count and my activity for the day. Swiping over again, I've got a weekly summary of my mileage. I haven't worn the watch this week, so it's blank, but this would show all of the running activities I've done for the week. Scrolling over again, we've got my nightly recharge, and this is a unique metric to Polar watches. This will let you know how effective your previous night of sleep was to sort of recharge your body. And again, you can sort of use this as a way to measure your body battery in Garmin terms, just here on Polar as well, but it's completely based off of sleep. Now, if we dive into the menu on this watch by clicking the lower left button here, you'll get a whole bunch of other options to start a workout, but also to go into things like your fitness tests here, which are also pretty interesting. So if I dive into this, there's an orthostatic test, a leg recovery test, an SpO2 test, ECG, a walking fitness test, a running fitness test, and a cycling test, along with a fitness test at the bottom here, which is just based on resting heart rate. Now, jumping over to the Suunto Race S here, if I scroll down from the watch face, that's where you get all of your health and wellness data. And if I scroll down, I've got my logbook for recent activities, a timer, notifications from my phone, we've got my heart rate measurement for the day, blood oxygen saturation, and then we've got something called body resources. So this is very similar to Garmin's body battery. Body resources here on the Suunto Race S basically gives you the same metric. It's a 0 to 100 scale, and it will let you know how many resources or what your battery is throughout the day. As your day progresses, if you go on a run or something like that, you'll see that your resources drop a lot quicker because you're expending more energy. And then as you sleep, the same thing will happen. You'll charge up your body resources to take on the day ahead. And again, just like on all of these other watches here, you do have a widget for your steps and calories burned. That'll give you your basic information. You've got an Alti-Baro, and you'll get all of your sleep metrics here as well. Scrolling down further, we've got our recovery HRV, which again is kind of similar to Garmin's HRV status. We've got our training progress, training records and activities, and then we get into navigation, which we'll talk about in a minute. Next topic, let's talk about smartwatch features on these watches. Because these are dedicated sport watches and not like an Apple Watch, all of them have some limitation when it comes to smartwatch features. Now, don't get me wrong, they all have the basics. All of these watches will display your phone's notifications for text messages, Instagram messages, emails. However, in the smartwatch category, again, that's where the Garmin Forerunner 265 takes the lead here, because the Garmin Forerunner 265 does have NFC payments for contactless payments. And speaking of integrations, music, because again, in the smartwatch world, that's where the 265 here from Garmin does have another big advantage, because not only does this watch have internal storage for music, where you can send MP3 files and store them on your watch and then listen to them phone-free on earbuds, but it also supports streaming music services. That means you can have things like Spotify, Amazon Music, iHeartRadio, and a few others, and you can sync the music with your watch and download the music to your watch and then go for a run with your Spotify playlist and not have to have your phone with you, which is super cool. And again, that is a unique thing to the Garmin Forerunner 265 and not available on any of these other watches. However, most of these other watches do have the ability to control your smartphone when you're playing back music. So if you tend to bring your phone with you and you want to skip a track or turn the volume up, you can still do that as long as you have your phone with you with the Polar Vantage M3 and the Suunto Race S. Unfortunately, the only watch in this lineup that has no connection to your phone or streaming services when it comes to music is the COROS Pace Pro. For whatever reason, COROS has decided to include music storage on this watch, so I can go in, scroll around and get to music. I can tap on that. And as you can see, I've got play, pause, skip forward and back. And I can pair earbuds directly to this watch and play back standard MP3 files that are synced to the watch. Unfortunately, it doesn't support Spotify or Amazon Music or any of those other services. And there are no music controls to your phone from the COROS watch. Jumping back to the Garmin Forerunner 265 here, another advantage to this watch is something called Connect IQ. Connect IQ is basically an app store for your Garmin watch, and there's a lot to choose from in this app store. Things like new watch faces, you've got different activity types, data fields, and a lot more, including things like GoPro remote controls and things like that. Some of them are free, some of them are paid. Okay, next topic is going to be navigation and mapping. So all of these watches do have some form of navigation and mapping. However, they do vary quite a bit. So on the Garmin Forerunner 265 here, this watch has something called breadcrumb mapping. So you'll see a little squiggly line of your track and your history of your location, but you won't see any base map around that. It's basically just a black screen with a squiggly line letting you know where you're coming from and where you're going. Now the Garmin Forerunner 265 can load pre-designed courses. So you can design a course in Garmin Connect on your phone or in their web interface and then sync that to the watch. Jumping over to the COROS Pace Pro, the COROS Pace Pro does have a full base map. So you will see not only your breadcrumb trail, but you will also see a map of trails, roads, waterways, and all of that in full color on the COROS Pace Pro. Now keep in mind, these maps are not routable, so you can't like pick a destination and get turn-by-turn directions to that point. But the fact that there's some context around your location is super helpful. And just like on the Garmin, the COROS Pace Pro does have the ability to design a course in the COROS app on your phone, and then you can sync that over to your watch and load it up and execute the course in real time with turn-by-turn navigations, with full base map, and it's a really good experience. It's all built right into the app. However, even though at the time of filming this video right now, there's no map labels on the COROS Pace Pro, in a future firmware update, COROS has promised that they're going to add text to the maps on the Pace Pro. So that is something to keep in mind. Okay, moving on to the Suunto Race S here. This watch has a very similar mapping and user experience as compared to the COROS Pace Pro. Both these watches basically have the same level of mapping and detail. The maps look nearly identical, and I wouldn't be surprised if they're leveraging the same data from all of their maps. So on the Suunto Race S here, you do have full color mapping. You do see trails and waterways and roads and things like that. But just like on the COROS Pace Pro, those trails and roads and stuff do not get labels. So you'll see the trail or road, but there will be no text on that trail or road to let you know what road or trail you're on. And just like the COROS Pace Pro, the Suunto Race S does have the ability to import GPX files, and within the Suunto app on your phone, you can fully customize and design a course. The Polar Vantage M3 has a very similar mapping experience to the COROS and Suunto as well. You do get a full base map experience on the Polar Vantage M3. When you buy the watch, you can choose what regions you want to download. The maps are completely free. And just like on the COROS and Suunto, you can design and import a course so you can follow it in real time and not get lost in the woods. However, unlike the COROS and the Suunto, the Polar Flow app on your phone does not have the ability to design a course. So you won't see a map page in the app on your phone, and you won't be able to design a course within the map page and sync it over to the watch seamlessly. You have to use a third-party service like Strava, Komoot, Map My Run, that sort of thing. Next up, let's talk battery life. And this is a whole can of worms, but all of these watches do have really good battery life. So on the 265, the big and small version actually have the same size battery, but the bigger version has a bigger display that draws more power. And because of that, the bigger version actually gets worse battery life. But in the best case scenario, with the smaller version of the 265, you will get 15 days of use with the always on display turned off, and you'll get between 18 and 20 hours of use in a GPS activity with automatic selection GPS mode. Jumping over to the Polar Vantage M3 here, with default settings out of the box, you'll get 7 days of use as a smartwatch, which is on the lower end of the spectrum out of all these watches. But in a GPS activity, you do get really good battery life of up to 30 hours with the highest accuracy setting on this watch. Jumping to the Suunto Race S here, it's nearly the same as the Polar Vantage M3. So you'll get about 9 days of use out of the box with default settings. up to 30 hours in the most precise GPS accuracy mode, and you'll get up to 40 hours if you dial it down to good GPS accuracy, which in my testing is really good. We'll talk more on that in a minute. And finally, we come to the COROS Pace Pro, which gets much longer smartwatch battery life than any of these other watches. With this one, you're looking at 20 days of use with default settings. Now keep in mind, those default settings mean that the always-on display is turned off, as you can see here, and the heart rate monitoring, the all-day heart rate sensor, is only taking a sample of your heart rate every 10 minutes. If you do turn on the always-on display or select real-time heart rate sensing, that will drastically reduce the battery life down to more like 8 to 10 days, depending on your use. And this watch is equally as good in GPS mode, where you'll get 38 hours with all systems mode, which is the default mode and gives you really good GPS accuracy, or 31 hours with the best accuracy in multi-band mode. Speaking of GPS accuracy, let's talk about that now. So all of these watches are multi-band enabled or dual frequency enabled. And what that means is that all of these watches can use 2 different frequencies to establish their position based on the satellites in the sky. Multi-band enabled watches are sort of the gold standard these days, but there's still a lot of variables like antenna design and what chipset they used and all of that. In terms of GPS accuracy, I've tested all of these watches at length. Again, go check out the in-depth review I've made for all of these watches individually, and they're all really good. Like, if you bought one of these and you just went out for a run, you're not going to complain about any of these watches. They all get really good GPS accuracy. However, if I was forced to pick a winner, I would pick the Suunto Race S here. I don't know why, just it performs really well when it comes to GPS accuracy. Again, they're all good, so just take that with a grain of salt. With that being said, keep in mind that I'm mainly a runner and a hiker, and I don't typically go open water swimming or anything like that, so it may vary in different activities. All I can speak from is my experience. And now that we're on the topic of accuracy, let's talk about the built-in optical heart rate sensors on all of these different watches and how they compare. Again, if you want to get into the weeds on this, check out my in-depth review for each one of these watches. But in this, I'll just summarize and say that all these watches have performed really well for me in my experience, and honestly, they're all pretty good. I wouldn't complain about them, again, if I weren't comparing them side by side. When it comes to heart rate accuracy, if I was forced to pick a winner in my personal experience, I might give a slight edge to the Garmin Forerunner 265, as it's performed really well in my experience. Okay, that brings us to the final segment of this video, where I want to talk final thoughts and which one of these watches might be right for you. First off, if you want the best smartwatch experience with your sport watch, and you want things like streaming music support, NFC payments, third-party apps, along with tons of health and wellness data that are really insightful, like body battery, HRV status, and training readiness, definitely go for the Garmin Forerunner 265. But it is the most expensive, and I do get that $450 for a plastic watch is a lot to ask, but I like it. It's a really good watch. Now let's talk about the COROS Pace Pro. This watch, I think, in my opinion, has a more utilitarian, a more tool-like experience that will help you accomplish your training goals and not worry about all of that other fluff like streaming music or third-party apps or NFC payments, none of that stuff. This watch has one mission, and that is to go out for your run or bike ride and sort of get out of the way, along with looking really nice. I like the aesthetic look of this as well. So I'd say if you're looking for the simplest device that will achieve your training goals, go for the COROS Pace Pro. And not only that, it's also on the lower end of the spectrum when it comes to pricing, and it does have the most color options. Jumping over to the Suunto Race S here. This watch has the best build quality out of any watch on this table. It feels like a super premium watch, and I feel like if this had the name Garmin on it, it would probably cost $1,000. However, it is $349, which is really impressive. Not only that, it also provides the best GPS accuracy in my opinion in my testing so far, and the updated heart rate sensor is a lot better than the old one and something I consider to be really good now. I would say if you opt for the steel version of the Suunto Race S at $349, this watch feels like a bargain. The only thing you're sacrificing is a lot of the smartwatch features and the ability to log into like a web interface on a computer, because that simply doesn't exist in the Suunto ecosystem. You basically need to use the app for everything. And then jumping over to the Polar Vantage M3. I would say this is a great option if you like a very simple user experience. In fact, the Polar Vantage M3 is probably the best option for someone who's already in the Polar ecosystem, but wants an updated watch with an AMOLED display. If you've got something like the Polar Vantage M1 or the M2 or the Vantage V2, something like that, and you want AMOLED, but you don't want a drastically different user experience, and you like the Polar Flow ecosystem, definitely check out the Polar Vantage M3. On the Polar Vantage M3, the build quality is also really good, and the unique metrics like nightly recharge and boost from sleep are a nice perk. The only thing I wish this thing had was an updated user interface that felt a little bit more modern, but Polar does have that big firmware update called Firmware 3.0 on the horizon, so we'll see what changes when that's rolled out in a couple of months. The moral of the story here is that none of these are bad watches. In fact, these are the best sport watches in this price segment, in my opinion. They're all very capable, they're all very good, they all have mapping and navigation and health metrics up the wazoo. The question is, which one is right for you? And I can't answer that for you because I don't know what your specific needs are, what features you find the most important. As always, if you did find this video helpful or entertaining, please consider going down and giving me a thumbs up and subscribing to the channel down below. And then after you do that, drop into the comments down below and let me know what watch you're thinking about getting, which has the features you want. Let me know in the comments down below. Did you buy one already? Are you looking to buy one? You're waiting for Black Friday or something? Comment down below. And then after you're done commenting, check out the video description down below where you'll find links over to pick up all of these watches. Those are affiliate links and they help support this channel, but they cost nothing extra to you. And then after you go shopping, also check out the links to my other social media accounts like my podcast, my Instagram, my Threads, my Strava, and check out my merch store. You can pick up a sweet hat like that. All right, friends, that's the end of this one. I'm starting to lose my voice. I've been talking a lot. Okay, gotta go. I'll see you next time. Bye.